Hi, and welcome to the Week 12 lecture on Developmental and Life Course Criminology. Developmental and Life Course Criminology begins with the difference between career criminals and criminal careers. Career criminals essentially see being a criminal as their job. They are life course persistent offenders, a term that we'll get to more later on. Whereas criminal careers are simply careers or a set amount of time that basically states that criminal activity starts at one point in time and ends at another point in time. They can be long or short. The idea of career criminals came from a 1972 study that showed that just 6% of juveniles committed roughly 52% of all instances that led to juvenile contacts with police. So research began to develop very quickly that tried to identify and inhibit the development of individuals that would have chronic contact with police. Developmental and life course criminology ended up refocusing criminological research from the macro level, i.e. studying crime rates, to the micro level, meaning the study of criminals. It also meant that criminologists started to really look at longitudinal research, or research that measured people's activity or people's likelihood to commit crime at multiple points throughout their lives. It became necessary for researchers to have data on single offenders or single possible offenders throughout their lives. So that's why longitudinal research really came in. Prior to developmental criminology, criminologists argued either that one was more prone to be a criminal from basically birth, so they had criminal propensity, or that people engaged in criminal careers that were of varying lengths. These were essentially two ends of a very polarized spectrum. Much of the field, most notably Gottfredson and Hirschi, came down on the side of criminal propensity. That raised the question, why are some people more likely than others to commit crimes? Gottfredson and Hirschi argued that one's propensity to commit crime is relatively stable after the age of 8 or so. They claimed this, and it led to a decline of longitudinal research. Essentially, there's no point in studying the amount of crime people commit over the course of their lives, because if you have an 8-year-old that is engaging in a lot of deviant behavior, that 8-year-old will continue to engage in deviant behavior, whereas if you have an 8-year-old who is not engaging in much deviant behavior, that 8-year-old is likely to continue not engaging in much deviant behavior. So if you know this at the age of 8, why would you continue measuring it throughout a person's life? It's very costly and very difficult for researchers to do. So Gottfredson and Hirschi, when they came with the advocating the criminal propensity hypothesis and got many people to join them in that hypothesis and that agreement, that led to the decline of longitudinal research. However, there were still many who continued to argue that career criminals were something that should be studied, that criminal propensity was not an accurate theory or an accurate concept in explaining criminality. And the career criminal hypothesis, or the career criminal camp, did continue to employ longitudinal research designs. Once we move into the late 1990s and early 2000s, we find that criminology had really made the two camps reconcile with one another. Research had found support for both the criminal propensity model and the career criminal model. And over time, these views began to see each other as being friendly or being closer to one another than their previous wars or battles with the other camps had suggested. This coalescence ultimately led to developmental models. From there, let's go into Farrington's piece on DLC theory and DLC's findings that it has to contend with. The Farrington piece is a meta-analysis of sorts. In one way, it's advocating for Farrington's theory. In another way, it is analyzing previous research that is along the DLC spectrum or other DLC theories, and presenting the findings of that research to you and criticizing that research in certain ways. So it's pretty rare that a noted theoretical criminologist will sit down with the theory that they have come up with and advocated for a long time, and so clearly lay out the opposing theories, the differences in the concepts between those theories and the theories that the criminologist is advocating for, try to explain all of the different underlying constructs or underlying ideas of their theory. So that's why this Farrington piece is so often cited and so useful to look at, because Farrington's really doing you a favor here by not only summarizing a lot of the other research that's in developmental and life course criminology, but is also showing you comparisons and contrasts between his own theory and the other contending theories in the field. So Farrington really starts off with the idea that we need to start by reviewing widely accepted developmental and life course criminology findings that all of the different developmental and life course theories have been designed to explain. So he lists these findings starting with one, the theory is concerned with the development of offending and antisocial behaviors. And the keyword there is development. We want to know where it starts from. And so the theories end up looking at risk factors for committing crime at different ages and the effect of life events on the progression or regression of the likelihood of committing crime and the actual commitments of crime. All developmental and life course theories are individual level theories. They look at changes that individuals go through throughout their lives. They are not looking at aggregate crime rates. Again, this is to say that these theories are micro level, they are not macro level. Developmental and life course criminology really started with the idea that there were career criminals and criminology had no theory really to explain them, and that criminology was almost entirely an atheoretical field. At the time, yes, criminology had borrowed some from Durkheim, Weber, Marx, the large criminologists, but there was not really the same emphasis on developing theories that could explain why crime was being committed that there were in fields like political science or sociology generally or economics, that criminology was really an atheoretical field. So DLC comes in partially as a way to try to rectify the criticism that the field was atheoretical. Another reason that DLC becomes very important is because we wanted to be able to explain why someone becomes a criminal in order to put better prevention mechanisms in order to reduce crime rates. This theory became, or this group of theories became very popular in the late 1990s in particular, because there were the results of 3 longitudinal studies, that all of which had been conducted by either local or national governments, came out, and the findings of these studies were able to be explained through developmental and life course criminology. So you have a theory that's kind of re-emerging as being very relevant to explaining crime, come out at the same time that reports that had utilized significant longitudinal data were being published and needed explanation. So the two really merged, and developmental and life course criminology became pretty significant in the field again in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Farrington lays out 10 criminological facts that DLC has to account for, that it has to be able to explain in order to be taken seriously. And these are all facts that we were aware of before the development of DLC, and have continued to be part of crime studies. And so any theory that's trying to explain crime needs to be able to account for these facts. One of the facts, and the most important one that that Farrington starts with, is the prevalence of offending really peaks in the late teenage years, from about 15 to 19. Theories of crime have to explain this. The onset of criminal behavior starts somewhere between the ages of 8 and 14, and we know that if you skew towards the earlier end of that peak onset era, so if you're skewing toward the 8 or starting even earlier than that, the likelihood that you become a career criminal that commits many, many crimes is greater than if your onset of offending age was 14. You're much less likely to be a career criminal if you start committing crime at 14 than you are if you start committing crime at 8. Fourth, offending and antisocial behavior in childhood and offending and antisocial behavior in adulthood is very correlated with one another. If you are a child that misbehaves and breaks the law, you're more likely to be an adult that misbehaves and breaks the law. The next one was that a small number of people at large commit a large fraction of all major crimes. The next one was that, or is that, offending is very versatile rather than being specialized. This means that when a child commits a crime, you can't tell if they're going to become, you can't tell if they're going to become a criminal, but you also can't tell what type of criminal or what type of crime they may specialize in just based on what type of crime they commit as children. Both thieves and violent rapists are likely to start out committing minor theft as children or adolescents. So we can't predict what type of crime someone's going to commit later in life based on the type of crime they commit early in life. Next, the type of acts that are defined as crime are only part of overall delinquent behavior patterns that these individuals are engaging in as children and adolescents. Other types of delinquent behavior include drinking, smoking pot, doing other illegal substances, not being engaged in school, not attending school regularly, among other things. One of the next facts that Farrington says DLC theories need to account for is that up until about the age of 20, most people commit offenses in groups, but after the age of 20, most crime is committed by individuals acting alone. And reasons that are given for this are varied, but most of the reasons that people give for committing crime under the age of 20 will be that they want revenge, or they need to get excited, or they are in need of something and so they commit theft. But after the age of 20, the reasons for crime are usually utilitarian. And finally, the different types of offenses are committed after different ages. So this is to say that shoplifting comes before burglary, which comes before robbery. After the age of 20, specialization in a single type of crime increases. So one is more likely to be a person that commits burglaries and become, if you will, an expert burglar, or one is more likely to be an offender that commits rape and kind of, again, if you will, specializes in violent sex crimes. So these are the factors that Farrington lays out that DLC theories must explain in order to be taken seriously. Farrington lays out some key explanatory factors in DLC. He says the main risk factors are individual, family, peer-related, and neighborhood-related. Individual factors that he points to are those that include low intelligence, hyperactivity, risky behavior, antisocial behavior like bullying and aggression. The family factors that he lists include poor parenting, harsh discipline, physical abuse at home or at school, parents who are rather cold to their children, parents who neglect their children, parents who are in conflict with each other, parents who are divorced, parents who are criminals themselves, and siblings who are delinquents. The peer factors included peers who are delinquent, being rejected by one's peers, and being unpopular. This also can be involved with school factors such as being delinquent from school, and neighborhood factors such as having a high crime rate in one's neighborhood. After the age of 20, there are factors that affect the likelihood that one gives up crime. These factors include family factors such as getting married and having children, neighborhood factors such as moving to a better area, and peer-related factors such as joining the military or getting a job that one finds engaging. Farrington points to many unresolved and contentious empirical issues that DLC needs to address. They're all listed here, but I'm going to only focus on a few of them. So it's not really clear how the frequency of the amount of crime one commits varies with age. We don't know if young, unexperienced offenders offend more than old offenders who have more experience in certain crimes. One can argue that the young might be trying out new sorts of crimes and thus may engage in lots of crime, or that the young are not very good at crime and are thus trying to ease their way into crime and commit it bit by bit and incrementally participate in more and more crimes, versus the old or relatively old offenders, those older than 20. Do they commit more crimes because they find it easier, or do they commit fewer crimes because their individual returns or their gains on committing a single crime is much greater than that of young criminals? So if you think particularly in terms of theft, do older thieves need to commit fewer crimes because they're better at picking out victims who have more to lose and more to steal? The next factor I'm going to discuss is the fact that it's not clear if the seriousness of offenses escalates up to a certain age and then de-escalates, or whether it doesn't change with age at all. This is one of the most important, pertinent questions for criminological research. We're not only interested in the amount of offenses one commits, we're also, of course, interested in the more serious offenses. And if life course criminology tells us that most serious offenses are committed by people under the age of 20, then we have even more reason to police and jail offenders up until they're about the age of 20. However, if life course criminology tells us that offenders are likely to be violent, equally likely to be violent throughout their lives, then that changes how we would treat young violent offenders. Meaning that if you committed crimes that were violent when you were young, we would be more likely, or would have more reason to tag you as a violent offender and keep closer eye on you throughout your life. Next is the fact that early onset of crime predicts a long career, but it is not clear whether it predicts a high number of crimes or a high average seriousness of crimes committed, or both. So we know that starting early means that you have a long career, but we're not sure exactly how that career trajectory or the crimes that are included in that career, how they play out. Fourth, we're not sure if chronic offenders commit more serious offenses or if they just commit more offenses. Finally, there are some factors that could be causes of offending, or they could be indicators of offending, or they could be both. It may depend on the individual. Take, for example, drug use. For some, taking drugs causes them to become less inhibited and to commit more crime. For others, drugs are a way of coping with the crimes they commit. So this is a difference between individuals that DLC needs to address. And finally, there's the fact that career criminals or criminal careers may also be intermittent. When we originally thought about criminal careers, we thought that they had a stopping point and an ending point, and between those 2 points was a regular, perhaps not frequent, but regular committance of crimes. But what we know now is that criminals may intermittently engage in crime for various economic reasons, perhaps. So we need to better be able to handle and address the possibility of intermittent criminal careers. Farrington's own DLC theory, he posits in contrast to other criminological theories. He says that other criminological theories are static, and thus they can only explain differences in behavior between individuals. So why one person commits crime but another person doesn't. What he means by this is that these theories, these static theories, can't explain why one person commits crime during part of their life but does not commit crime during another part of their life. He points to other dynamic theories that are able to explain why a single person commits crime some of the time, but not all the time, as theories that include labeling theory, social learning theory, rational choice theory, and routine activities theory. But he also criticizes routine activities theory and rational choice theory by saying that these theories don't explain some of the empirical issues that developmental life course criminology is able to get at. Farrington also criticizes Gottfredson and Hirschi's self-control theory as anti-development, because they say that control is developed in childhood and it is stable throughout life, and aging is ultimately what prevents individuals from doing crime, not marriage, not jobs, not children. So for those reasons, Farrington labels it anti-development. He also points to several key questions that DLC theory must explain. A couple of the most important ones are, why do people stop offending? This is really the heart of all criminological theories. We want to know why people offend and what makes people stop offending so that we can better target policies to prevent crime or reduce crime. We also want to know why prevalence peaks in the teen years. Why does co-offending decrease from adolescence to adulthood? So why up until the age of 20 is there usually crime committed in groups, gangs, but after the age of 20 we usually have criminals on their own? And what are the main motives for offending? Next, let's address the key theoretical issues that DLC has to explain. There are many of these issues, many of which are listed here. But let's go and talk about a few of these in further detail. The first one, what is the key construct underlying offending? So what's the real causation of offending? Farrington says that in order for the theory to be valid, it really has to get at what causes offending. One of the other large theoretical issues that DLC has to explain, according to Farrington, is what factors inhibit offending. Is it the potential for facing penalties for a crime? Is it the connections to your family? Is it just a factor of aging? These are all examples of factors that are thought by some to inhibit offending. Farrington, again, says that the theory has to be very specific as to which factors actually inhibit offending. Farrington also notes, if you look down, to what does the theory explain and what does the theory not explain. This may seem very basic, but it's really quite strange how many theories do not make it clear what they actually explain and what they do not explain. And so Farrington's making a point here that the theory has to be really clear where its limits are, what it's able to do, and what it's not able to do. Going into Farrington's own theory, Farrington's own theory is called the Integrated Cognitive Antisocial Potential Theory. It combines elements of strain, control, learning, labeling, and rational choice approaches. Its real key idea, however, is that what underlies offending is what Farrington termed antisocial potential, or AP. The theory assumes that antisocial potential is the underlying factor causing antisocial behavior. And antisocial behavior is a cognitive process, not a biological process. So it's not caused by hormones, it's caused by the way that the brain puts information together and thinks through situations. Farrington also notes that AP can be graded from low, so one has very low antisocial score, meaning that one is fairly social, to having a very high antisocial potential, which means that one is very antisocial. Farrington says that AP is distributed across the population in essentially a bell-shaped curve, and that levels of AP vary with age. So any antisocial potential can grow over time. It can also retract over time. Farrington notes that people with high AP are likely to commit various different sorts of antisocial acts. As previously mentioned, this includes crime, but isn't limited to it. It can also include delinquency from school, alcohol and drug use and abuse, among others. The ICAP theory focuses on explaining criminal behavior in young, low-class males. That's really the subset that Farrington did his research on, and this is to say that the theory is not meant to really assume or try to explain offending in females. The theory also concentrates on explaining the factors which cause personality traits and events that then result in the antisocial potential in the long term. So these events and factors include attachment ability, anxiety levels, antisocial modeling, impulse control. The model claims that some individuals will be more likely to offend due to the opportunities presented to them. So even if a person, or even if two people, have equal levels of attachment ability, equal anxiety, equal antisocial modeling, equally low levels of impulse control, if they're in different situations, they may respond differently due to their own personalities, due to their own cognitive processes, such as cost-benefit analysis. So the theory recognizes individuality. Farrington claims the ICAP model addresses several key questions. These are done in four-part slides, or 4 slides. The first part of the slides again, we'll go over some of the questions that the theory addresses, but not all of them. So Farrington says that theories have to ask, why do people offend? And theories also have to have an answer to that question. ICAP's answer is because of high long-term antisocial potential, high short-term antisocial potential, and a changed decision-making process. Next, how is the onset of criminal activity explained? Farrington says that it's explained because behavior of antisocial potential varies over time, and because changes in routine activities, opportunities, potential victims, and decision-making processes all essentially align at a time in an adolescent, usually his life, to enable the start of criminal activity. Next, why do some offenders continue to offend? The answer to that question, according to Farrington, is because a person's antisocial potential stays very steady over time, at least after puberty. And finally, why do some people stop offending? Farrington says that this is because of decreasing long-term antisocial potential, decreasing short-term antisocial potential, and changed decision-making processes. It's interesting to note that how Farrington kind of addresses that the phenomenon of people stopping to offend is by saying that antisocial personality potential can change, whereas previously he really emphasized that antisocial potential stays fairly constant throughout one's life, at least after the age of 8 or 9. So in some ways the theory is a little contradictory here. Going on to the next set of slides, looking at the middle point, Farrington says that theories have to be able to explain why early onset predicts the criminal to have a lengthy career. And he says that the answer to that, according to ICAP theory, is because the early onset of beginning criminal behavior reflects a high level of AP, and if one has a high level of AP, one is likely to continue to have a relatively high level of AP throughout one's life, and to continue thus committing crime. Next, looking at claims 8 through 10, Farrington says that theories have to be able to explain why co-offending decreases from teen years to adult years. And he says this is because boys offend mainly with male peers, and the influence of male peers is most important in the teen years and decreases over time. Finally, Farrington says that theories have to be able to point out the main motives for offending, and he says the main motives change from teen years to adult years. Most teens want to have fun, or they want to obtain, the new piece of technology or the new cool clothing, so they steal or commit other crimes. After the ages of 20, though, the reasons are very utilitarian for committing crime. Finally, his last point, he says that theories have to address what are the effects of events, of life events on offending. And he says the life can affect long-term and short-term variations in antisocial potential, both positively and negatively. Obtaining a steady, good job can reduce antisocial potential in the long term. Getting arrested and convicted of a crime can increase antisocial potential in the long term. Fighting with a mate can increase short-term antisocial potential. Farrington also makes several claims about what DLC addresses and what ICAP addresses. He says, before we had mentioned the theories need to have and identify a key factor that causes offending. Farrington says that it's antisocial potential. He also says that what theories have to identify the factors that encourage offending. He says ICAP does this by saying that strain, impulsiveness, antisocial models, being bored, opportunities, potential victims, and the expectations of getting a large return from crime are all the reasons that ICAP gives for offending. Farrington says theories have to address, is there a learning process that goes on? And he says that ICAP says yes. And there are at least two learning processes, actually. One is that parents socialize their children, so that's one learning process. And the second is that delinquent peers can teach others their ways. So, for example, gang members can initiate new members into the group and can show them different ways of committing various crimes, including different ways of running drug rings. 5, he says, is there a decision-making process? Again, Farrington says in ICAP, yes. ICAP says that people generally make decisions that seem rational to them, although there are other factors that can have an influence. Farrington says, what does the theory explain? In regards to ICAP, it explains differences between males in offending and differences over the lifetime of males who offend. So it can explain essentially differences between males who do and do not commit offenses and changes in individual males and when they have offended and when they have not offended. What does the theory not explain? It doesn't explain differences in crime rates. It's not looking at aggregate totals of crime, nor is it designed to explain females' participation in crime or differences in crime between races. And I would also add to this, it's not really designed to explain white collar crime. It's really designed to explain property crime and violent crime. Finally, what findings would challenge the theory? Any findings that have evidence that suggests that there are different types of offenders or any different pathways to offending. Since the theory focuses on antisocial potential, it really limits there being any other cause for offending. There are 5 other DLC theories in addition to ICAP, and we're going to discuss all 5 of them here. And in later slides, we'll compare ICAP to these 5 theories to see where they agree and where they disagree on concepts. The first theory that we're going to go over is the Catalana and Hawkins theory. It's called a social development model, or SDM. The theory states that one can either have antisocial pathways or pro-social pathways. Antisocial pathways include opportunities for antisocial behavior. It rewards antisocial behavior and ultimately antisocial bonding. The theory discusses that there's bonding to society, there's consistent attachment, bonding can include commitment to other people, and beliefs can all balance antisocial behavior. Offending is caused by antisocial behavior that comes from a desire to be self-satisfying, particularly measuring the costs against the benefits of any behavior and deciding that the benefits outweigh the costs, at least to the individual. Whether or not someone offends is determined based on whether their antisocial or pro-social behavior bonds are stronger. Next is Sampson and Laub. Sampson and Laub say that they have an age-graded informal social control model. Basically, this means that the bonds one has to society change over time, and people do not commit offenses when they have strong connections to their family, their peers, their school, their spouse, or their jobs. Whether or not one commits crime is a cost-benefit analysis, according to Sampson and Laub, and the potential costs are personal relationships, suffering. Sampson and Laub further state that crime peaks in teen years because of the close association with delinquent peers and the ability of those peers to recruit individuals into crime networks and criminal activities. Next is Moffitt. Moffitt divides people into two types of antisocial people: life course persistent offenders and adolescence limited offenders. Life course persistent, or LCP, offenders are underlined by neuropsychological problems like hyperactivity and low self-esteem, and these people will never be able to establish normal prosocial behavior because of their problems. However, adolescent limited offenders are temporary. They begin at puberty. They often start due to social mimicry, trying to be like the cool kids. And they stop when they can achieve their social desires legally, so in early adulthood. These people stop offending because they can, just like they started offending because they could. They have prosocial behavior, they have no neuropsychological problems that inhibit them from ceasing to offend. Many other criminological theories will reference life course persistent offenders. This is a very common term throughout criminology. Finally, we'll go into the LeBlanc and the Thornberry Crown. LeBlanc says that his theory looks at integrative multi-layered controls of offending. The primary cause of offending for LeBlanc is lack of control. Control comes from how bonded one is to their school, their family, their work. Personalities develop over time, according to LeBlanc, and it's a continual battle of being self-centered versus having empathy. Modeling, which is either prosocial or antisocial behavior, and constraints that include socialization and beliefs. Environment influences bonding and cognitive ability, influences personality. When bonding is weak, the person is more likely to commit crime. When people develop new bonds, offending is likely to decrease. Bonds are likely to be weak in the teen years. In adulthood, people start to develop bonds again as they build their families. So offending is consistent throughout adulthood because people's bonds stay steady over their adult lives. Thornberry and Crown theory is interactional theory. The development of offending, according to Thornberry and Crown, depends on other life course trajectories such as relationships to parents, commitment to school, and commitment to work. Offending under this model is not assumed to reflect an underlying trait, but is instead thought to be the result of different things at different times. This model recognizes that there are two-way reactions between events. Social bonds affect offending, and offending affects social bonds, for example. This also means that prior antisocial behavior has a causal effect on later antisocial behavior. Meaning, for example, that if you are a part of a gang as a teenager, you are more likely to grow to become friends with other criminals because you know them and you will have criminal friends into adulthood, rather than perhaps becoming friends with Nobel Prize laureates because you don't have connections to that community. This is the idea that one choice affects another. Long-term offenders in particular reflect this related causality. And ceasing to commit crime is due to changing social factors for all offenders. So This includes tightening the bonds with their family, participating in intervention programs, becoming involved in long-term relationships, those such things. Differences between other DLC theories and ICAP. There are several here, and again, I'm just going to hit the highlights of them. So ICAP versus all of the other theories except for Moffitt. ICAP incorporates strain theory to explain motivations, and the other theories do not focus on strain and how it can relate to individual offending. The next one, ICAP versus Sampson and Laub and LeBlanc. ICAP suggests that the consequences of offending influence the future of offending through learning or through labeling processes. And Sampson and Laub and LeBlanc disagree with that. So it's the idea that there's this consequence of offending that is likely to affect future relationships and the likelihood of reoffending. ICAP versus Catalano and Hawkins and Thornberry and Crone. ICAP assumes that attitudes and beliefs are indicators of antisocial potential, but not causes of it. ICAP versus LeBlanc. ICAP does not assume background and environmental causes cause personality development and bonding, and through intervening variables cause criminal behavior. Finally, unlike ICAP and the other four, Thornberry and Crone do not cite an underlying stable trait that causes antisocial behavior. Finally, what are the future directions for DLC and ICAP specifically? There needs to be tests that empirically examine and empirically test the predictions of ICAP. These key predictions include that ICAP says that individual offending frequency and seriousness of offending would increase during teen years, then decline due to antisocial potential. The next one, ICAP predicts that early age of onset in committing crime predicts many crimes throughout the life and committing very serious crimes throughout the life because of high levels of AP. Next, ICAP predicts onset sequences, so behavior in crime can be heterogeneous. ICAP predicts within individual changes in risk factors would lead to within individual changes in AP, and then changes in the individual's offending. ICAP predicts that short-term factors like drinking influence offending and can explain some variation in the offending of a single individual. ICAP predicts that different factors influence the likelihood that a person offends before age 20, such as friends, versus factors that affect the likelihood of committing a crime after the age of 20 and the persistence of offending after age 20. ICAP predicts that the CJ system should be a deterrent for future offenses. That's it for this week. Have a nice one. Good luck with everything.